What is it? Something relevant now?
No, no.
We're just waiting for our live feed to come back up. It should just be a moment. On the record, I neglected to instruct the witness prior to our last break not to speak to counsel regarding his testimony or anybody regarding his testimony, so I should ask the witness, did you speak to anybody regarding your testimony?
Not regarding my testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander, we have just returned from closed session. Please continue your public cross.
Thank you. Mr. Hurling, I'm going to present to you a response to OPC data request 15-09. And, Your Honor, if you would, I would like this to be marked as OPC Exhibit 3.
So marked.
And I would note that if you see the red, that means that the red cross-out means is that, well, Brian Weber was still on this answer, but that you and Mr. Horga have taken this from Mr. McGlynn.
Okay.
This was information provided by Transource Counsel.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Alexander, what are we waiting for?
Oh, you haven't gotten a copy?
Oh.
Yeah, that's all. I'm ready.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's not your fault.
Okay, this is OPC Exhibit number 3.
Mr. Hurling, this DR basically asked, at the time of the response, November 27, 2018, is Transource already recouping the charges for the Project 9A? And it says here that they are currently collecting costs, and that it's done by zone. So cumulative $18 at November 27, 2018 was for BGE around $191,000, correct?
Yes.
And for Pepco zone, it was about $202,000, correct?
Yes.
Do you have an additional question, Mr. Alexander, on this exhibit?
No, I'm sorry. No, Your Honor. I'm about to state that I'm now going to, Mr. Hurling, I'm now going to show you a response to OPC DR 20-03. Now, this was prepared under the direction of Mr. Horger, so I would like you to know if you can just confirm one or two things. I won't be going into any tremendous detail. I'll basically be asking the same questions that I just asked you on the other one.
Okay.
Okay, so this, we were briefly discussing the response by PGM to OPC DR 15-09, and this DR 20-03 asked for an update. Now, in this update, for what Transource has already collected through its formula rate, for Transource Maryland, for BGE, that's around $253,000, correct?
Yes.
And for the Pepco zone, it's around $267,000, correct?
Yes.
Now, if you turn the page, you'll see that the answer is also provided for Transource Pennsylvania, correct?
Yes.
So for the BGE zone, it's around $534,000, correct?
Yes.
And for Pepco, it's around $564,000, correct?
Correct.
So you would add to see what Transource is already collecting from the ratepayers in the BGE and the Pepco zone. You would add you take the first page and you'd add the roughly $253,000 to the $534,000 on the next page for Transource Pennsylvania, correct?
Seems correct to me.
Okay, and the same thing, you'd go back to Pepco and you'd go to the $267,000 number and you'd add that to the $564,000 number, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Now, since PJM filed the application at FERC on behalf of Transource, I would gather that you're aware that as part of their order, as part of the FERC's order accepting this application, they granted Transource's request for an abandonment guarantee, correct?
I am not personally aware of all the terms of that, but that is a fairly common element of incentive rates.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you, do you know what an abandonment guarantee is in terms of what FERC is doing? And if you don't, you don't.
Yes. Yeah, I do.
Okay. Can you just briefly explain what an abandonment...
Because the project was approved by PJM as the RTO, that if it does not go into service, that they'd be entitled to some degree of rate recovery for the costs that they had prudently incurred while under our direction.
Okay, and if this project gets canceled because of different reasons, but let's just say either Maryland or Pennsylvania commissions, either one or both, deny the application for the issuance of a CPCN, ratepayers, because of the abandonment, and if the line is canceled, because of that abandonment guarantee, ratepayers will never get this money back, right?
I don't know how
Okay.
that works. FERC can do pretty much whatever they want, I believe, as
Okay.
far as rates are
No,
concerned.
if you don't know, I don't
Yeah.
want to. You know a lot. I don't have to ask you for things you actually don't know. It's just because you know a lot about everything. Okay. Now I'm going to show you.
Do we have more? Four.
Oh, well.
Come on to Steve. When did,
Your Honor, did I ask that the response to 20-03 be marked as an exhibit?
You did not?
Okay, can I have that marked as OPC Exhibit 4, please?
Mark that as OPC Exhibit 4, and I suspect you want OPC 17-6 marked as OPC 5.
Correct. Thank you.
All right, those items are so marked.
Thank you. Now, this is OPC 1706, and the response was prepared by or under your direction, correct?
Yes,
Okay, and these were questions relating to generator deliverability, correct?
yes.
And if I can, again, in the layman's term, well, actually, it states here, a generator deliverability test is a test that determines whether a generator qualifies for the status of a certified capacity resource with respect to the installed capacity obligation imposed under the Reliability Assurance Agreement. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay, now, capacity resource is not the same as an energy resource, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and capacity is actually priced on its own as a promise to provide energy when requested. If I'm wrong, just please.
No, that's a reasonable way of describing it.
Okay. And so my question is, well, do your answers to these questions remain accurate today?
Yes, I expect that they do.
Okay. So if you take a look at subsection D, the question posed, and we can stay on the first page of this, and let me just say the acronym M as in Mary, E as in Edward, T as in Tom, and U as in You Bet Chocolate Syrup. The question posed in 17-06D is, if a market efficiency transmission upgrade, a Me-Too, proposal is required to address a generator deliverability upgrade, please explain cost allocation between the capacity resources assumed for the generator deliverability study and Me-Too. Is that correct?
That's the question, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Alexander, we don't need to repeat the questions that you asked Mr. Hurling in the data request. I assume you'll be moving these into evidence
Yes.
at some point. Okay. So
Yes.
what we have them there. Ask your question of the witness.
Okay, so if you take a look at your response, and without reading it, this is the response to 17-06D, is it fair to state that notwithstanding the identification of future reliability violations after the IEC project was initiated, the IEC project remains a market efficiency project?
Yes, it is a market efficiency project.
Okay.
But just, you know,
Go ahead, please.
I'm not sure how that relates to this question. The question says if a METU proposal is required to address a generator deliverability upgrade. That's not what Transource 9A is about. Transource 9, that's what my answer speaks to. You know, this relationship between capacity and generator deliverability has nothing to do with the Transource 9A project. Generator deliverability is a test that we use for multiple purposes, including the identification of capacity qualification of new generators, but it is also the basis for all reliability analyses that we do to demonstrate compliance with NERC standards.
Well, I
That
think,
being said, it has nothing to do with why 9A was selected.
right, so that's all I was asking. It remains a
Right.
market efficiency project, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Here's my,
Do we really need a DR for that?
here it is. Mr. Hurling, oh, well, first of all, Your Honor, Mr. Hurling, I'm going to show you a response sponsored by you to OPC DR 17-04. And Your Honor, I believe that would be OPC Exhibit 6, correct?
It would.
I don't know if I said it right. This is 17-04.
Sorry.
Now, Your Honor, I know you don't like me. If I don't read these questions, these answers will make no sense on the record. So please allow me to do that.
Mr. Alexander, you have a lot of red welds before you.
Yes.
And so I could make my evening plans. How many more data requests do you plan to, or how much more time do you believe you'll need of Mr. Hurling this evening?
How much have I taken now?
About an hour and 10.
Okay. Okay, well, they're all here. Okay. I don't think it will take more than another hour, and quite probably less.
Okay. All right. Let's see how you ask your question for exhibit number 6.
Okay,
Seven.
Mr. Hurling,
That's for the next one. No, okay. Hold on. Okay.
this is directed to your rebuttal testimony in the Pennsylvania proceeding before the Pennsylvania Utilities Commission of the request of Transource to for the issuance of a CPCN. Do you recognize these questions and answers?
Yes.
Okay. And so the first question asked you to identify, or asked PJM in essence, to identify all upgrades required to address the overloads identified on the new Furnace Run-Conestone 230 kV line, which is a 14% overload, and the new Furnace Run-Graceton, Graceton, 230 kV line, 42% overload through PJM's generator deliverability study. And your response is that no such analysis was performed, correct?
Yes.
And then it was asked you to provide a cost estimate for the required upgrades, which we talked about in this subsection A. And you said no such calculation was performed. See the response to subpart A, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if these generated
Mr. Alexander, I suspect his response to C is going to be no such analysis was performed. I hate to answer for the witness, but is that your answer, Mr. Hurling?
Yes.
Okay.
So, Mr. Alexander, if the witness doesn't change his questions and he's going to authenticate his response and nothing has changed since the response date, we'll just move these into evidence. Unless you have additional questions.
No, in this case, Your Honor, I don't. Thank you. That's fine.
That's 7 of those, yeah. Well. Is it 6-4?
Because good enough. All right. I'm going to show you your May 4th, 2018 response to OPC DR 8-11. And, Your Honor, I would like that marked for as OPC Exhibit 7.
So marked?
Thank you. Now, I do have some additional follow-through questions for this one, Your Honor.
We just need a copy, Your Honor.
I'm trying to figure out where it is.
Oh, it should have been the next file.
These are the ones.
Here.
Off the record for a minute as you find your folders. So you need to be out here by... Okay, we'll be out here by before
Here we go.
Okay. Okay. That's what this... This is about... Okay, so what are we on now? Okay. Okay.
back on the record.
Okay, Mr. Hurling, does the information in your response remain accurate to date?
Well, these are all references to reports that were published some time ago, so obviously that to the best of my knowledge, they haven't changed. These are from our market monitor. These are not PJM documents.
Okay, and this is all to support the statement by Mr. Bedlin, now you, that the AP South, and can you state what the AP means? Can you state what the AP stands for?
Allegheny Power.
Thank you. This is all that the AP South reactive interface was one of the most historically congested flow gates in PJM, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as of, I should have said this, as of the date of this response, was everything accurate?
I believe it was, yes.
Okay. And thus the independent market monitors, the IMMs, monitoring analytic reports of the PJM state of the market for the year 2018 had not yet been published as of the date of your response of May 4, 2018, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. This is it. All right, Mr. Hurling, I'm now going to show you a section of the 2018 State of the Market Report for PJM, and this is the section on congestion and marginal losses, which is section 11, and it begins at page 511. Now, as the head of TIAC, as well as your other responsibilities, you read all of the market monitor reports, correct?
Number one, I am not in charge of the TIAC.
Well, I'm sorry. Do you want to? I don't mean to misstate, but in your various duties, do you?
And number two, no, I don't read the market monitor reports.
You don't?
I do not. I believe Mr. Horger does,
Oh, so maybe I should save this for him.
perhaps.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Alexander, are we marking this?
Um,
If we're not going to use it with this witness, we should just hold on to it.
well, here's my trouble, Your Honor, is that the response that Mr. Hurling has adopted cites to all of the PJM Independent Market Monitor's reports,
Well, it cites to the
which I've
reports.
gone through. So then there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to discuss the 2018 report, since these are all cited as support for the proposition that this is the most historically congested interface in PJM.
We can discuss the 2018 State of the Markets report for PJM, but I don't believe that the witness would be able to authenticate this document. So we could discuss it if you like as exhibit.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, OPC
Yeah,
exhibit
that's fine.
number 8, which will not be moved into evidence. Okay, your question, Mr. Alexander.
Yes, I do. All right, Mr. Hurling, if you take a look at the first sentence, when there are binding transmission constraints and locational price differences, load pays more for energy than generation is paid to produce that energy. The difference is congestion. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you go to page 2, and you go to, well, when I say page 2, it'll be page 512 of section 11. It says the overview of congestion costs, correct?
Yes.
Now, in this instance, for 2018, the congestion cost increased by 612 million, or 87.8%. Since this is all about congestion relief, would you consider that amount significant increase?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to go, because I know that the chairman will push me on. So, I would like to go to page if you would go to page 531 as on the bottom right. And it says here constraint duration.
Yeah.
By the way, let me ask you, even though you don't read them, do you consider the independent market monitor's marshaling of statistics to be something that you could generally rely upon? Not his conclusions or their or interpretations, simply the data.
The market monitor does a good job analyzing data, yes.
Okay, so I want to limit it to that. Now, for the constraint duration, and this lists the constraints for 2017 and 2018 that were most frequently binding, and which experienced the largest change in congestion event hours from 27 to 2018. Is the AP South on this list?
I don't see it on this list.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you go to the next page, which would be 532,
Is that a related facility?
the top 25 constraints with largest year-to-year change in occurrence 2017 and 2018. Is AP South on that list?
I don't see it.
Okay. If you go to the next page, 533, and you go to line 14, and this is constraint costs, which is what the Transource line was approved to reduce, correct?
Correct.
And it's at line, or it's number 14 out of 25 listed. It's the top 25. So it's number 14 on that one, correct?
Correct.
And the AP, is that Dominion for the DOM on the number one?
AEP DOM is the AEP Dominion interface.
All right, and that's the one with the most constraint cost, right?
Correct.
And isn't one of the is Cornerstone Peach Bottom one of the projects that the independent consultant we've been talking about, is this one of the projects that they reviewed as part of their white paper?
I don't think so. Well, 9A impacts it.
If it's
I don't see Cornerstone Peach Bottom on this.
Oh, okay, then I got it. We can move on. Don't worry. I will take that your answer is based on your quick review, no. Is that all right?
Correct.
Okay. And if you look at the top 25 constraint, this is page 534, affecting PJM congestion costs by facility for 2017. The AP South is number 6 of 25, correct?
Correct.
Okay, which means there were 5 ahead of it even on this one, correct? Well, that's,
Yes.
never mind.
So all those
If you
that would be relieved by.
look at the, on page 536, the BGE control zone top congestion cost impacts, if you look at line 10, it says the AP South out of 20 listed is right in the middle at number 10, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if you look at the, well, these effects are different, but what is the JCPL control zone?
Jersey Central Power and Light in
Okay.
northern New Jersey.
Well, the AP South is going to be low on that regardless because of its location, so we can skip that. If we go to page 539, the PEPCO control zone, if you take a look at line 9, the AP South is 9 out of 20, with, again, the AEP Dominion being the number 1 of top congestion cost for that zone, correct?
Correct.
And just to make it quicker, the PPL control zone on page 540, AP South, and this is the top congestion cost impacts, is 16 out of 20, correct?
Yeah. Just again, since this is really not, my area, we're noting the AEP DOM interface, and I will obviously need to defer to Tim Horger, but the Transource 9A project resolves congestion on a number of flow gates, including AP South, including AEP DOM, and a number of other interrelated transmission facilities. I don't know whether those facilities are on this list or not, based on a quick scan. But if you really want to get to the bottom of this, you may be better served with Tim Horger.
That's fine, and if we can stop the examination here, and I'm just going to have a few questions because it's related to this. I'm going to give you the first quarterly report of the 2019, and I'm just going to ask you a very few questions about 2 or 3 of the statements there. It's not going to go into the detail of all the zones.
Okay?
Look for it. It is? Okay. No, that's the first order. Bear with me 1 second, Your Honor. I apologize. This is the 2018. Do you see the 2019 one? My.
Yeah, why don't we go with it then?
Your Honor, can we go off the record for 1 minute?
Off the record.
Bernardo just made these copies for me.
You can't with this now.
No, because I'll take it later. Okay, I've got it. We can go back on the record.
Why don't you pass them around first?
Okay, here you go. Why did she not, wait, that's not it, sorry.
Well,
I've got it, Your Honor.
Oh, yeah, the shopping cart. I didn't notice that. I saw that.
I'll never get there the other way.
I was looking, I didn't see how long.
do you have
4 days.
Nehru staff trip for volunteers from Papua New Guinea.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah. I'll have to go back into the Navy to get there.
that's right.
Are we back on the record?
We are now back on the record.
Okay, and so, did we ID the 2018 report?
We did as
as-
number 8. Let's mark this as number 9, OPC 9. I suspect you'll be asking the witness very similar questions to the two.
Actually, I'm going to try to, believe it or not, to cut it short. Do I have one of those? What I can cut it short is by that if we went in the same kind of data tables, that I will represent to you that the AP South generally is much higher in these tables than in 2018. So, because I want to be fair and accurate.
Okay,
And I see you looking. Do you accept that?
I'll accept that.
Sometimes as high as number 2, number 6, but generally much higher than the 2018 report, correct?
I'll accept that.
Okay. But what I want to ask you about is if you go to page, the second page, which is listed on the left side bottom as page 512, and again, this is the first quarter of 2019. In contrast to the year 2018, where congestion costs increased significantly, would you agree that a decrease of $497 million or 75.2% is significant as well as the increase in the 2018?
Well, the number may be significant, but without knowing the context, I don't remember what the circumstances were in the winter of 2018, but we may have had a milder winter in 2019, and that would be the result, which may have been the result why 2018 was so much higher than 2017.
I believe that in 2018, if you go to page 513, and if you read where it says conclusion, if you're with me,
Yep.
the second paragraph basically answers your question, that it decreased significantly from the first 3 months. The decrease was a result of high day-ahead congestion in January 2018, which is a result of high gas costs and associated LMPs, that's P as in Peter, in the early part of January 2018. Now, without necessarily agreeing with that statement, do you understand it?
Well, I understand it, but it still doesn't discuss why they were higher. And again, that may have been weather. I don't know.
Okay. So, forgetting the reasons why, isn't it true that congestion costs were up significantly in 2019 overall, not on the AP South, but overall in the PJM region or footprint? They were up significantly in the year of 2018, but in the first quarter, at least, of 2019, they decreased significantly. Forget the reasons why.
Compared to the first quarter of 2018, that's certainly what it appears, yes.
Okay. So, wouldn't you agree that, do you have a copy of OPC expert witness Doug Smith's testimonies?
Yes.
If you go to Mr. Smith's rebuttal at page 5, table 1.
There we go.
It shows the historical congestion on PJM interfaces, correct?
Figure 1, yes.
Okay, and if it's a little bit easier if you look at the first attachment. This is a little bigger, and you reviewed his direct and rebutted that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had a chance to look at this?
This chart? Yeah.
Okay. So, doesn't this chart show that for the AP South, after peaking in 2014, the congestion costs have significantly gone down through 2018, or at least through the middle of 2018?
Yeah, but what it really shows is that the congestion into the area served by this collection of interfaces is distributing over a number of different constraints. Obviously, AEP DOM has picked up significantly in the last year. Some of the others are increasing as well, Grayston Safe Harbor. Bottom line is we have transmission limitations that are preventing the flow of energy into Maryland and Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia on a number of interfaces. While AP South dominated that congestion, it's now being distributed over a number of interfaces. Bottom line is, in order to get the cheapest energy into the area, we need a solution to the congestion, whether it's on AP South or some combination of these. And that's, that's what our simulations have been showing, is if you look at Transource 9A, it's managing all of this congestion. Not eliminating every dollar of it, but it creates significant transfer capability into this area through the western half and the eastern half to manage AEP DOM, AP South, Grayston Safe Harbor, Conestone, Peach Bottom. Just looking at one slice of this is not really relevant to the issue of getting energy into this area.
When you say it does it, this table provides, using PJM data, the congestion cost of AP South, AEP DOM, Grayston Safe Harbor, and Conestoga Peach Bottom, right?
Correct.
So it's 4 interfaces that it's showing, and if I recall correctly, and if I'm not, this whole process that led to Project 9A and Transource started in around 2013 or 2014, correct?
The models were built in 2013. The analysis was started in 2014.
Okay, so when you did that, the AP South and the AEP DOM were at just a little shy of $500 million.
Yeah, they clearly peaked in 2014.
Well, but that's when this was originally modeled, correct?
The analysis that was done in 2014 would have been before the 2014 actual congestion was known, and it would have been a projection of congestion out over the next 15 years. So we don't actually use the historic congestion in the problem statement as much as we look at a forecast of congestion over a 15-year period.
Well, but that's what I'm puzzled about, because the DR that I just showed you before said that AP South is historically the most congested area, but none of the tables that we saw from the Independent Market Monitors report or anywhere else supports that
Well,
we've been given.
Well, but again, you showed me tables from 2018. Historically, AP South by itself was the most congested interface. Now that congestion is distributed over a number of interfaces, all feeding into the same area. So if you look historically, clearly AP South was by itself the biggest component of the congestion feeding into this area. Now there's still significant congestion. In the last couple of years, it's grown back up again, and it's spread out over multiple interfaces. Bottom line is there's still congestion with respect to energy feeding into this area. It's just now more distributed over a number of interfaces.
Well, Mr. Hurling, when you say that it's the same but distributed over more, I'm looking at a cost in around 2014 of $475 million, and I'm looking even now when these constraints are going off at a cost of $200 million. That's a decrease by basically 50% today than it was in 2014. Isn't that correct?
Sure, but if you look at 2012 or 2013, we're actually higher than we were back then.
I'm looking at 2012, and when you say higher,
2012 was 75, 80
right,
million. Now we're up to 230.
and that's exactly, you have rebutted Mr. Smith's testimony, correct?
I believe so.
And isn't his point that congestion let me go back for a second. Isn't it Mr. Smith's testimony that PJM has followed all its rules, correct?
I'd have to go back. I seem to remember him, acknowledging that.
Okay. And he also acknowledged that under many circumstances, congestion may result in higher costs to ratepayers, correct?
Yes.
But he also stated that in this case, congestion costs, at least on these interfaces, can vary widely over the years. Doesn't this table show that? Forget the reasons why. Doesn't this table show a great variation in the congestion cost for these four interfaces for the last 7 years, 6 years?
Sure, there has been variation, and with all of the assumptions, that have evolved over these years, our simulations still continue to show persistent congestion feeding into this area on a number of interfaces, to a degree that there are cost-effective solutions to resolve that congestion for these customers, and we should be, in PJM's view, we should be pursuing a solution that will mitigate this congestion and bring cheaper energy into this area.
If you had done those simulations, though, and I assume you did, PJM did, in between 2013 and 2014, did any of the simulations, strike that, in around 2014, in any of PJM's modeling or simulations, did any of them forecast that when you were doing a 5 or 10 year, 15 forecast, that within 2 or 3 years it would drop from 475 million to 25 million, less, 20 million? Did any of these scenarios forecast that?
I don't recall. I'd recommend you talking to Tim Horger about that.
Okay. And if I can take you back for 1 second to, it doesn't matter, we can go and look at OPC 9, which is that market monitor report. If you take a look at the first page again, which is headed Congestion and Marginal Losses.
Which one are we looking at? First quarter 2019 or?
Yeah,
2018?
it's the same on both. But yes, let's look at the one on, just so everybody is on 2019, the quarterly.
Okay.
Okay, if you take a look at the first full paragraph on the right side of the page, I would like you to, just to yourself, to read that paragraph.
Okay.
Did you understand what the market monitor was saying in this paragraph?
Yes.
Okay. He starts off, well, it's marketing and monitoring analytics, states the first part of the first sentence is congestion is neither good nor bad. Can you explain that from based on this paragraph, what the, not your opinion, but what the monitoring analytics, the IMM, is saying that?
Yeah, and I don't know whether they are speaking to individual hours of the day or year upon year. Obviously, what he's saying in this paragraph is that congestion is a normal function of the grid. There will be transmission limitations at times, that will prevent the cheapest energy flowing into a given area. And I certainly agree with him on that, but the real issue from a planning perspective comes down to when that congestion persists over years and years and years, and we can demonstrate that there are transmission fixes that in a cost-effective manner can eliminate that congestion. From a planning perspective, we view that as our responsibility to try to optimize the efficiency of the marketplace.
Okay, that's all I wanted to. Thank you. You just answered the question. Now, I could give you, and we can tow back another DR, but instead of doing that, let me just say that OPC 06-04B as in boy asked, what are the reasonably foreseeable consequences to the benefits cost analysis if the IEC's project and service date is delayed beyond June 1, 2020? And the response was the analysis requested has not been performed. Do you accept that as the, so I don't have to go through the
I
identification process?
believe that's the answer we gave, yes.
Okay, now, has that response been updated since April 23, 2018? I'm asking you because I don't see it.
I don't know.
Okay, so, and I know that there's been some question, and maybe this is Mr. Horgus, not your turf, and just tell me. We'll move on. I heard that Mr. Webb has said that it's only going to be delayed a few months from June 1, 2020 to, what did I hear,
November.
November 2020. So here's my question. I know that parts can be ordered beforehand, correct? Before the commission, the respective Pennsylvania and Maryland commissions order the siting, correct?
You can always order things.
Right.
with,
And they can sign contracts, correct?
sure.
With contractors, I mean, in addition to their own people. But can they, are they permitted, when I say, is Transource permitted to start building this project until and unless the Maryland and Pennsylvania commissions approve the issuance of a certificate of public convenience and
Assume
necessity?
that's a question better directed to the 5 people to my right.
Oh,
I don't know what Transource is and is not allowed to do by law if they don't yet have a CPCN.
oh, okay, that's fine. Well, let me ask one more question on this. You testified in the Pennsylvania proceeding, correct?
Yes.
There was a second part to the proceeding, correct?
There will be a second
will be.
part, yes.
Right, so that isn't, so are you aware of the briefing, the schedule, and the schedule for when an order will be released in the Pennsylvania proceeding?
No, I'm not familiar with that briefing.
So it could be 2 months and it could be 6 or 8 or 10 months, correct?
Objection.
I don't know.
Sustained.
Okay. Okay, I'm now going to show you, this is 2-1. On page 13 of 18, copy 7.
Sure.
So, can you help?
Yeah. Any questions?
These are 4s. We're looking for 2-1. Everything got shifted over.
This comes in. You just point
Is one of these 2-1? No. Oh, let's look at this. Not here yet.
That's it.
I have another. Your Honor, I'll take one more minute, and if I can't put my hands on it, we'll move on to something else, okay? Is that all right, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. Alexander, you estimated you need about another 15 minutes. Is that about right?
It's probably going to be longer. Not much longer, but longer.
Okay, well, let's keep it moving. We'll recess no later than 6 p.m. this evening.
Okay. I'm sure it was here. Oh, I'm sorry, 2-01. Nope. Yeah, 2-01. Okay, I'm going to move it on, Your Honor. Did you pull any of these out?
We're going to be off the record for just 2 or 3 minutes.
Wait,
Record.
don't worry about it. I missed one. Thank you. Where's mine?
Let me just put this here. This is 8.
Mr. Alexander, your next question.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun.
This is the package.
Dun, dun, dun.
2.7. Okay.
Dun, dun, dun.
That-
All right,
this
so
is-
we gave
okay.
them 2-01, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to, Your Honor, can you tell me which exhibit we're up to kindly?
We're up to exhibit number 10.
Okay, so this will be, number 10 is the response to OPC 2-1. And as so, in the filings by Transource Maryland and Transource Pennsylvania, there was this statement: market efficiency project 9A, including the project, is expected to produce approximately $620 million in congestion savings over the next 15 years, and was determined by PJM to have a benefit cost ratio of 2.48 in the baseline scenario and a benefit cost ratio that exceeded 2 in all sensitivities and reached 4.67 in one sensitivity. Is that correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay, now the question was, using that exact same sentence, that as of the date this was asked, there was a blank for million and a blank that exceeded in all sensitivities and reached blank in one sensitivity. So the answer, if I got right, the 3 numbers requested have not been calculated for the context described in this request, correct?
Yes.
And that the analysis PJM performed did not include these sensitivities, correct?
Correct.
So, wouldn't you agree that it's very difficult to compare apples to apples if in one case these sensitivities were done and in a case just a year or 2 or 3 years later, actually 2 years later, they weren't done anymore?
Well, the point of this original sensitivities was to give us information with which to compare the proposals and make a selection as to the most robust, the most cost-effective solution, which we did. When we were doing the updates, the benefit-to-cost ratio requirement in the operating agreement is not based on the sensitivities. It's based on the essentially standard assumptions that go into our analysis. So the requirement that the project continue to meet the 1.2 benefit-to-cost ratio is not based on the sensitivities, and they were not performed at the time. Again, this work would normally be done by Tim Horger's staff, so you can ask him further, but it makes sense to me why we would not be running these sensitivities again.
Thank you. Okay, where's 9-6? Where's my pal? Thank you. I'm now going to ask you to take a look at OPC, your response to OPC 9-06. Your Honor, I would like this to be marked as OPC Exhibit 11.
So marked.
And the question was, please calculate the rate impact on ratepayers of Market Efficiency Project 9A annually for 2021 through 2026. Now, this is asked because the forecast for the benefits of this project go up to at least 2026. And you stated, well, PJM stated that the analysis requested has not been performed and that the benefits are not calculated by utilities, correct? It's zonal, right?
Well, number one, yes, the analysis, PJM doesn't do rate impact analyses, and the market efficiency analysis is by transmission zone, not by, oh, wait a minute, not, no, it's the benefits and costs. Okay, yes, they're calculated by transmission zone, which in many cases are utility boundaries. In some cases, they comprise multiple utilities.
So the PEPCO zone is not included in this table, correct?
It is not.
Based on the other discussions that we've had, there will be no impact on ratepayers in the PEPCO zone?
Based on the other discussion.
I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. Where's my... I don't need that, that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at response that you're now sponsoring on the, instead of Mr. McGlynn, of OPC 4-6. And, Your Honor, I would like that to be marked as OPC Exhibit 11.
So, 12.
12, I'm
so
sorry.
marked
Got it.
12.
So this question was, has the rate impact on ratepayers of Project 9A been calculated by year or by any other period from the project's designated in-service date through up to the following, and it would be 2 years, 3 years, et cetera, up to 10 years? And the answer was no to each one of these number of years, correct?
Correct.
So there is Mr. Hurling, isn't it true that even if such a calculation could be performed, it would be extraordinarily difficult and even then would not produce accurate numbers, correct?
I'm not a rates expert. I have no way to answer that question.
Well, this is what I don't understand, but you sponsored the answer, correct?
Paul McGlynn was the original witness.
But you took the, according to counsel, you
But
took
the question was asked, and we didn't perform the analysis. So the answer no is something I am prepared to give you. Extrapolating to how difficult it would be to give you an answer if we did do an analysis is outside of my expertise.
Okay, let me just ask you then this question. Isn't it true that due to the architecture of the PJM transmission grid and the fact that over the next 15 years new projects will become in service, no one, not even PJM, can say with assurance when Maryland ratepayers will know when, if built, the IEC Transource project will definitively pay off for them?
I don't even know how I would begin to answer that question. If you look at the congestion that is relieved and the cost of the project, there should be benefits to Maryland ratepayers. Whether or not other factors change the dynamic and add additional costs for Maryland ratepayers, I can't possibly speak to that.
I understand, but you use the word in this response right now, should. So I'm saying is that based on a 15-year forecast, when during that 15 years can PJM say that if a Maryland ratepayer looks at the cost of this and says, okay, it is now paying off. When is that year that it's going to pay off?
I haven't done that calculation.
And no one else has at PJM, have they?
I don't know.
Well, no one's given an answer in DRs.
That's not a question.
Objection.
Okay. Does Mr. Horgan know that?
I don't know.
Okay. So the answer is, just to be clear, that you don't know when Maryland ratepayers will know whether this line has pursuant to forecast now will pay off.
Objection.
Sustained.
It's not this one. If you go to your rebuttal testimony at TJH-R6, and that's at page,
You're talking about Mr. Horger's rebuttal testimony?
yes. You know what, I'm going to leave this out. Okay, following completion of the study phases of a project such as this, and if the developer chooses to move forward, excuse me, for new generation that seeks to come online, following completion of the study phases, and if the developer chooses to move forward, PJM, the developer, and all impacted transmission owners proceeds with an interconnection service agreement execution, correct?
Yes.
And what precedes that is the facility study agreement, correct?
We execute a facility study agreement and then perform the facility study before we tender an interconnection service agreement.
Okay. Now, the facility study agreement is also called an FSA, correct?
Correct.
And a interconnection service agreement is abbreviated or said as ISA,
Correct.
correct? And the ISA defines the developer obligations regarding cost responsibility for required transmission system upgrades, correct?
Yes.
And the ISA also confers the rights associated with capacity or energy generator resource status and specifies any operational restrictions or other limitations on which those rights depend, correct?
Yes.
And PJM may also include other reasonable schedule dates for milestone events such as permitting, regulatory certifications, or third-party financials arrangements. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, now, what is Doug's
Let's
testimony?
go to his testimony.
Do I have that here?
Else is in his testimony.
I'd like for you to turn to, I believe you said you had Mr. Smith's testimonies in front of you, or with you?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like you to go to page 22 of his direct testimony, and this is testimony that you had the opportunity to rebut, correct?
Yes.
Okay. If you take a look at line 6, it says PJM has modeled Project 9A 5 times, correct? Is that right?
Yes.
And each of the reevaluations concluded that Project 9A was forecasted to exceed the 1.25 benefit/cost threshold, right? That's something you would agree with, right?
Yes.
Okay. And now if we go to the table that updates on the next page the cost and benefit values, you can see that the reevaluations were August 2016, September 2017, February 2018, September 2018, and February 2019. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And that the benefit cost ratios ranged from in August 2016 from 2.48 to September 17, 1.3, and February 18, 1.32, and then September 18, 1.42, and then February 19, 2.17. Are those all accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you'll stay with me for a second, if you go to page 24, isn't it true that through a filing at PJM, through a filing at the FERC, the FERC granted PJM's request to change the rules for modeling for a market efficiency test. And those became in operation as of mid-February 2019, correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay, and then what happened is, if I understand it correctly, is that since 2014, PJM has included in the base case model all proposed generators with FSAs until February 2019, correct?
Correct.
And then in February 2019, the FSAs were excluded from the base case. And is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and the reason that was given is that many of the FSAs were not ultimately constructed and added to the system. There was a lot of drop-off. Is that a
Correct.
short way of saying it? And thus, by including, and again, I want this to be fair, all the units with SFAs, they were potentially including excess generation on the system that would never be realized.
Correct.
Correct? Okay. However, tell me if you agree with Mr. Horga's statement in his rebuttal testimony that PJM found that from 1999 to 2018, 36% of completed generation projects with an executed FSA reached commercial operation. Would you generally take that as accurate or subject to check?
That's the number I recall. Yes.
Okay. So, even though roughly, on average, 36% of generators with executed FSAs reached commercial operation, the new rules that FERC approved at PJM's request and that were approved in February 2019 eliminated all of the FSAs. Is that correct?
Well, we can't know which 34% are going to move forward or 36% and 64% are not going to move forward. So you have to include them all or none. You can't we can't be picking winners. That would unfairly bias the analyses. You have to go with the percentages.
Well, you're saying the percentages to me were that you could have just excluded as a group 64% of them.
But which
of the
64%?
FSAs. You can do it as a number.
No, you can't. You're talking about scaling the units down to 36%?
All of the units or as a group? I'm asking as a group.
The FSA generators, if you scaled them down, you would skew the results. It would create all kinds of problems with the analysis. That's a very bad way to do it.
Okay. Let me do it this way, because neither of us want to argue. By eliminating the FSAs, well, let me say this. When potential generation signed FSAs, at least in the architecture of the grid, they can be an alternative way of relieving congestion. Correct?
Correct. But we know, based on recent history, that the well more than half of those units will never come into service. So we would be counting on relief that would not eventually be available.
I understand that. And I'm sorry if I didn't ask the question right. If FSAs go to ISAs and then become online,
Right.
they can be an alternative way of relieving congestion on the grid.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So when the new rule came in, and I understand that I understand PJM's reasons from what you said in your testimony, from what you said here, but by changing that rule, didn't it affect, or let me say it this way, by changing that rule, it affected the benefit cost analysis, correct?
Sure. In our view, it gave a more accurate result because you're not including a significant group of resources that are not ever going to be built. The reason we included the FSA generators was years ago we had a higher degree of completion of FSA generators and we had a higher level of load growth. So if you project it out over 15 years, you needed that generation to serve the load, and we had an expectation that the generators were going to move forward. As time has moved on, for whatever reason, more and more generators are signing their FSAs, but then eventually dropping out and not going into service. So our analysis was being skewed by this large number of projects that were in the model but never going to be built.
But isn't it being skewed the other way when you eliminate all? I understand the reason
To
why
a
you said
lesser
you did,
degree.
but it does skew it, correct?
To a lesser degree, sure.
Okay. Your Honor, I may be ending. I'm just doing a check right now. Okay.
The only problem is they can't enter the without paper. That's 11.
Okay, Your Honor, I would like to move into evidence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Was 7 the market monitor report, Your Honor?
No, 7 was data request 8-11.
Okay, let me see.
The market monitor reports were exhibits 8 and 9.
8 and 9, right? Okay. So I'm going to ask that 7 be admitted, and then 10, 11, 12. I don't think that I can move into evidence through Mr. Hurling based on his testimony, 8 or 9, because he said he hadn't read them. So I'm only going to ask that the DRs basically in the white paper.
DRs and the white paper, which is OPC exhibit number 1. Do any parties have objections to moving into evidence OPCs 1 through 7 and 10 through 12?
Just to number 11, Your Honor, it is an incomplete DR. There was a page 2 to this that was not attached to the DR that had been presented to the witness. So, if we can-
9-6. Can I just check that out for a second? Your Honor, will be if you want to close out, we will produce and attach and complete the second page to that DR.
If
and
we can
we'll-
find that page, and Mr. Erling's still here tomorrow, we'll take care of that. So we will move into evidence OPC exhibits 1 through 7, OPC exhibits 10 and 12. Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman and Commission.
1 was OPC exhibit 1 was taken from witness Horder's rebuttal, so we're replicating it. We were not given it separately. Good evening, Mr. Dean.
Good evening.
Your witness.
Good evening.
Good evening to you as well.
Regarding your rebuttal testimony, could you turn to page 8? Lines 11 through 14.
Okay.
And this discusses the, you note the reliability criteria violations that were identified after the application was made. And those are listed on page 10, I believe.
Yes.
And it's your testimony that the project, if approved, would also resolve these violations.
Yes, the violations would not occur, so they would therefore have been resolved.
And if the project's not approved and not constructed, PJM would need to take action to get these 5 violations resolved at that point.
Yes, in some fashion, we would have to pursue solutions to those 5 violations.
And the cost of resolving those, part of that cost would also be allocated to Maryland ratepayers?
Yes, because they're reliability criteria violations, the cost would be allocated based on the predominant flow and the degree to which individual transmission zones contribute to that flow. So Dominion would, assuming the flows are going to be from a north to south, you would expect the Maryland, maybe not Delmarva Power and Light, but the other Maryland companies, Pepco, Dominion Virginia Power, all to pick up a share. That to be clear, because the one is a 500 kV violation, assuming it were solved with a 500 kV facility, half of that cost would be socialized across all of PJM, including the Delmarva Peninsula.
Thank you. Turning to page 11 on your answer to the question starting at line 8.
Yes.
You're saying the project will also increase the maximum megawatts that can be imported under peak conditions into the BGE load deliverability area. And then your answer also says the increase in capacity emergency transfer limit provides capacity benefits to this low deliverability area by reducing the likelihood of price separations in future capacity auctions. Could you explain exactly what you mean by the price separation here?
Yes, we run a capacity auction every year for the period 3 years into the future. This year the auction was delayed for various reasons, but normally we would have run an auction in May. This is 2019, so it would have been for the planning period starting in 2022, so June 1, 2022 to May 31st, 2023. So the capacity is procured, including a reserve requirement to ensure the adequacy and the reliability of the grid. All load pays for that capacity. If there were no transmission limitations, you would have one uniform capacity price for the entire PJM system for the entire year. That is typically not the case. In the past, Baltimore Gas and Electric and Pepco have separated on a number of occasions. So just like transmission congestion, where energy cannot be delivered into an area and we have to raise the price on the receiving end, the same thing happens in the capacity market. So if there is a transmission limitation into BG&E and we cannot import sufficient capacity, we cannot procure sufficient capacity in the auction without hitting that limit, we then have to procure more internal, higher-priced capacity, and you result in capacity separation, capacity price separation. That hasn't happened in Baltimore in the last auction, maybe the last couple. Tim Horger could probably give you a much clearer answer on that. It has happened in the East, in New Jersey, for example. But then the price for that capacity for the whole year is higher than it would be otherwise. So if you increase the transfer capability by building a line into the area, the likelihood of separation is reduced. In this case, because there was no separation in the last auction, we don't count that as a benefit in the calculation of the benefit to cost ratio, but the likelihood of some future auctions separating is reduced. So you can expect there to be a benefit of some magnitude, but it would not be considered in our calculation.
Thank you for that additional explanation. Turning to page 22, at line 18, you assert that upgrading the grid and resolving congestion will enhance deliverability of solar and other renewables. Were you here when Mr. Weber discussed the state legislation that required additional renewables?
Yes.
Could you explain why this would still be true if the renewables are going to be located in Maryland, such as the solar renewables?
Yeah, renewables, if they're down on the distribution or lower transmission levels, this line probably wouldn't have much of an impact on their deliverability. If they're if we're just talking about solar built in Maryland, if you had a lot of solar built out on the Delmarva Peninsula, this would increase the deliverability of those resources generally, and back to the rest of Maryland to a degree as well. With wind, offshore in particular, but wind anywhere outside of Maryland, this capability would definitely increase the deliverability of any wind resources from Illinois, from the Jersey Shore, Delaware, Maryland shore, back to Maryland.
Now, when you're talking about offshore wind and solar on the Delmarva Peninsula, is your answer that this will increase the access to these because the power flows from the Delmarva Peninsula through Pennsylvania and back into Maryland?
As a general matter, the individual resources are going to be just dispersed into the grid where they are, and by displacement, if you introduced 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind on the Delmarva Peninsula, you would be pushing some of the other resources on the Delmarva Peninsula, up into New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and for distribution to the rest of the grid. If you didn't, if you started bumping into transmission limits as you move away from the Delmarva Peninsula, that would restrict the deliverability of those resources. So new offshore wind in Maryland would probably see limitations on their deliverability in the interconnection queue. As you eliminate those constraints, the deliverability of those resources is improved.
In general, will the increase of required renewables in Maryland and perhaps in Virginia from their statutes reduce the overall need for the line, as has been asserted in other testimony?
it really depends on where the resources are located and what transmission is required to interconnect them. If you just add solar, not on the peninsula, but on the mainland part of Maryland, that would probably have an impact of reducing load when the sun is out, okay? Wouldn't necessarily reduce congestion all the time, but it would probably reduce congestion some of the time. So you have to look at the intermittency issues with solar and realize that the congestion that we're dealing with in this case occurs under lots of different conditions, times of day, times of the year, when solar may not provide any benefit to that congestion. So there would be some benefit, but it would not, I don't think, you couldn't view it as resolving the congestion. You mentioned offshore wind. If you look at Virginia, there are tremendous limitations of what Virginia is trying to do, bringing offshore wind to the nearest 500 kV transmission facilities, for example. We've done one series of feasibility studies for those resources. They're going to require substantial transmission upgrades to make those resources deliverable. So it's kind of the same phenomenon, except with Maryland, the Delmarva Peninsula is geographically separated, and you're right, it does kind of have to work its way up and over. So it's hard to say yet, depending upon how many megawatts would try to be introduced in Maryland, and for that matter in Delaware, what kinds of transmission limitations we might see to that deliverability. So until you know what transmission the generators are responsible for, it's very hard to say what benefits they would provide.
Thank you. Staff has no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Mr. Cran.
Just two questions, or two documents. Mr. Hurling, could you refer back to, I hope it's still up there, OPC 6 that was just entered into evidence? It is the DR response to OPC 1704.
Yes, have it.
You have that. This refers to your rebuttal testimony in the state of Pennsylvania, correct? Specific pages 29 and 30.
Yes.
And to your recollection, the upgrades that would be required to address the overloads that are the subject of this series of questions, are they in connection with the conceptual alternatives that had been proposed here in Maryland?
This is particularly conceptual alternative 1.
Correct.
And it is the overloads that are described, the furnace run to Conestone and furnace run to Grayston, are the two lines that comprise the conceptual alternative themselves. So they are substantially overloaded. We did not look at any further upgrades to try to make them work.
Thank you. There's a document, exhibit OPC number 9. It was not entered into the record, but could you refer to that?
Which was it?
It is the quarterly report from the
yes.
Market Monitor dated 2019.
Yes, I have it.
And the first page of that document is page 511.
Yes.
And counsel for OPC referred you to a paragraph on the right side of the page there at the near the top of the page. Do you see
Right.
that? And he referred you to the first sentence of the Market Monitor's report regarding congestion either being good or bad. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
Would you draw your attention to the last sentence of that paragraph and read that sentence?
Load in the constrained area pays the higher price for all energy, including energy from low cost and energy from high cost generation, while generators are paid the price at their bus.
And do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And in this instance, what is load?
Customers, residential customers, commercial customers, industrial customers.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor. That's all we have.
Thank you, Council. Do commissioners have questions? Commissioner Herman.
Good evening, Mr. Hurling. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
I had a couple of questions. With respect to, you discussed the constructability review,
Yes.
and I guess I was a little confused because when the project was proposed, it was really a line from from point A to point B, right? From
In this case, it's
Run to
actually
Conestone.
two sets of lines, one in the west, one in the east. Right.
Let's just pick east,
Yes.
okay? And so it's no specific line, but then you say you do a constructability analysis to see if you're going to cross wetlands or do this or do that and look at species. But how do you do that if you just sort of have a hypothetical point A to point B, but nothing is specific? How do you do a constructability
And
analysis?
this is why it's high level, because they have to look at the likely, straight line paths and some margin around that. In some instances, it's very specific because we had a case in New Jersey where there literally was only one way, because of a river, there was only one way to get from point A to point B, and it went right through wetlands and a lot of environmentally sensitive areas. So sometimes it's very specific. Sometimes you have to look at a broader area.
Okay. And if you would look at page 12 of your rebuttal testimony.
Yes.
So, I'm looking at lines, really your response to the line that's on, the question on line 15. The way I read that statement, it sounds like because generators and other entities have relied on the fact that 9A was going to be built, this commission needs to approve it because otherwise we're going to undermine the entire RTEP process. So
No,
that's
no.
how I read that.
No.
Can you perhaps?
That was
tell
not
me
my
what you meant
intention.
by that?
There are a number of consequences with respect to reliability. One is that we would simply have to start from scratch looking for a solution, which would take some period of time. If we were to get a decision later this year, we would rerun the analysis early next year. I expect that we would identify the violations or similar violations to what is included in my testimony. We would then have a competitive solicitation, which would take a period of time, make a selection. But with all, realistically, we wouldn't have a solution identified until the end of 2020. That developer would then have to go through similar processes to get that project, whatever that might be, approved through CPCNs and other permitting processes. So there would be a period of time of delay where load would be at risk, for these violations, and that could manifest itself simply as more congestion, where our operators are able to control those violations simply with higher cost generation, or it could manifest itself in extreme circumstances where we might very well have to shed load in order to prevent some failure of the system, a collapse. The bit about generators depending upon it, that is simply a recognition of the fact that some number of generators in the queue have been studied with this project assumed in our cases, and their studies would have to be rerun.
Right.
And that would cause them a delay, and that...
And they assume that risk because everybody knows that these
No, absolutely.
that these even if it's modeled within the RTEP, that it's not a done deal until you get the citing from the various authorities that you need.
That's
proof
correct.
from.
It would represent a delay for those parties. However, the cost of any additional upgrades to make those generators deliverable in the absence of 9A, those projects would be viewed as baseline projects, not the responsibility of generators. That's a principle from FERC that the generator, they have to deal with the delay, but they're not responsible for the changes in our RTEP. So the load customers would be responsible for those changes.
Okay. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the conceptual alternatives and sort of on a broad basis,
Yes.
not individually speaking. I from my review of the materials, I understood that the conceptual alternatives were hypothetical opportunities from PPRP to use some existing lines. Is that
Correct.
correct? And so those, and therefore, as everybody seems to recognize, those haven't been proposed to be built by any entity,
That's correct.
right? But then earlier in your testimony today, you said something to the effect of if the commission were to choose, hypothetically, 3A, then you would somehow get that built. So I'm confused by,
Right.
how would that happen?
In citing proceedings, some number of times, the commission will require a change to the project that was proposed in the CPCN. We've had lines in Virginia where the commission required Dominion Virginia Power to put some portion of the line underground. Okay? That doesn't change the route per se, but it certainly changes the impedance and the cost and any number of other factors. As long as the line, the impedances of the line, still solve the problem for which it was intended, that's what the state orders. That's what we will integrate into our RTEP. In this case, if you were to order, just hypothetically, if you were to order the eastern part of the line to be moved out onto those existing rights-of-way in some fashion, we would do analysis to see whether that adjusted configuration solved the problems for which it was intended, and if they did, then that's what we would implement. For all intents and purposes, the western part would be identical. The eastern part would be conceptually similar, except that the line would be longer by virtue of going out and down. If different conductors had to be used because the PP&L towers can't handle the conductors that AEP was proposing or Transource was proposing, we would have to look at the new impedances and the new ratings and see if it still solved the problem. Based on the analysis we did for conceptual alternative 3A, it appears that with those assumptions, that while not as robust and not as effective, that it would in fact solve the market efficiency issues and not create reliability issues.
So, with respect to your contractual arrangement with Transource,
Yes.
would Transource be required to pick up 3A if the commission were to say, we would approve 3A, but we won't approve what's been proposed? I mean,
That's a good-
then again, all hypotheticals,
Yes.
but just trying to understand I'm just asking if from your contractual from PJM's contractual arrangement with Transource, is that something that could be done?
Their obligation to complete the project is subject to regulatory approval. Okay? So if you require them to do something different, I don't know legally whether they are still bound by that contractual obligation. If they choose to be, we would obviously have to amend the designated entity agreement and refile it at FERC. But I believe our operating agreement supports that concept.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Just one more question. What I thought I read was that the shares that a zone pays for the transmission project are allocated at the beginning, and that's set, and that never changes
For market efficiency.
for
that's
market
correct.
efficiency. But the forecast can continue to change, including the cost of the project and everything else. So, particularly since the cost benefit analysis changed in early 2019, it's still not appropriate to take a look at the allocation for the various zones?
I'd have to check with my legal team, but I don't believe we are allowed to change the cost allocation if it's the same project, regardless of any change to the assumptions or the benefit to cost ratio calculation. If it was a different project, I think we would again, this is subject to conferring with my lawyers. I think we would have to refile the cost allocation because the description of the project would now be different, and we'd have to file that at FERC, and I think we would have to file a new cost allocation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Early.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Good evening. I want to direct your attention to page 9 of your direct testimony. I want to ask you about something that you say there. In response to the question on line 6, the second sentence, you say corporate and state boundaries are not considered when taking operational action or making planning decisions. What do you mean making planning decisions part of that? I mean, you don't disregard the differences between the states and our different state policies and that sort of thing, right?
The comment that we make is that if we have a problem in the District of Columbia, the best solution may be in Maryland, it may be in Virginia, so we ignore state boundaries when we look to find the most effective solution to any particular problem. Similarly, we ignore transmission owner boundaries. There are many places in the PJM system where the transmission owners are somewhat wrapped around each other. So in New Jersey, a solution to a problem on the public service electric and gas system may very well be an upgrade to a Jersey Central Power and Light facility. So we ignore the boundaries between the transmission owners, we ignore the boundaries between the states. If there's a policy that has to be satisfied in a state, we would absolutely consider it.
Okay. That's really what I'm getting at, because if you look at it from a purely electrical engineering standpoint, what you say there makes sense.
Right.
But if you look at it from a policy standpoint, these states are very different. We may have policies that require the repurposing of brownfields. We may have policies that require, land preservation. We may have policies that preclude transmission operators from doing certain things that may be set in statute, actually.
Yes, and we would make every effort, first of all, to be aware of such policies and regulations, and we would certainly hope to factor those into any decision making.
I think, and I think it's our job to require that, right? The commission, for sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. That helps me understand what you were talking about there. So you said repeatedly, and I think Commissioner Herman just touched on this a little bit, when Ms. McLemore was questioning you, you said you would accommodate a state change as long as it still meets our needs.
Right.
What happens if it doesn't meet your needs?
That's a tricky question. If it didn't solve the congestion, let's say in the extreme that the benefit to cost ratio was less than 1, that the cost was actually going to be greater than the anticipated benefits, I think my operating agreement kind of ties my hands there. I can't tell the board to put a project in that doesn't meet the requirements that are imposed on us in our operating agreement by FERC. If it created a reliability criteria violation, for example, as we found with conceptual alternative 3, it may be very simple to fix that and still be consistent with the benefit analysis for market efficiency. So as we added a transformer to conceptual alternative 3 and created 3A, it could be that you would have some relatively minor issue that we could fix and still be well within the requirements of market efficiency. So we would look for every opportunity to do that.
Okay, but in no case would you proceed against the order of the conditions may be placed in the CPCN. You wouldn't.
Oh, no.
You wouldn't.
No.
Okay, just making sure.
Yes.
So are you familiar with the former Mid-Atlantic Power Pathway project?
Yes.
Me too, very painfully. So that project was a project that was going to come across the Chesapeake Bay, come out of the river on the eastern shore,
Calvert Cliffs.
and come just north of Calvert Cliffs and land and tie in, go out to Chalk Point. And similarly, at the time, state legislators liking this project were very exercised because I was one of them about the path it was taken. But can you explain to me what happened with that project?
That project was required for a number of reliability criteria violation issues. Specifically, there were tremendous potential voltage collapse issues with the need to bring energy across the top of the Chesapeake into New Jersey and the Delmarva Peninsula. What happened during that time period were a number of things. There were significant changes in customer behavior, the implementation of efficiency programs, for example. Demand response increased dramatically, especially in the eastern parts of PJM. There was a lot of generation build, natural gas generation in New Jersey. So what you had was a lowering of demand and an increase in supply in the east, which backed off all of those flows that were wrapping around the top of the Chesapeake and completely eliminated the potential for voltage collapse. So once we saw that, we took to our board and they canceled the project.
Yeah, so I'm wondering why the RTEP process didn't foresee that, because I have to tell you, as a legislator that represented the landing site on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay, I was told this was required. We were going to have blackouts. I was told that my constituents were going to pay hundreds of millions of dollars more. I was told all the things I'm kind of hearing here in this case, but the RTEP, which approved it, didn't see any of that stuff that caused it to collapse.
And some of the changes, we're trying now to do a much better job of forecasting. For example, we reach out to look at sales projections related to heating efficiency, cooling efficiency, lighting efficiency. We look at sales projections for rooftop solar for residential customers. So we have a much greater ability to anticipate some of those behavioral changes, but we don't have an ability, for example, to yet forecast the impact of residential storage devices, for example, or substantial proliferation of electric cars. So the impacts of those could go either way. They could actually make the congestion tremendously worse over the midnight period. If we were charging millions of cars in Maryland and Washington, D.C. over the midnight period, the transmission congestion could be ungodly. So we're trying to improve our forecasting abilities, especially with respect to consumer behavior. The huge surge in generation build in that time period was somewhat unprecedented, and has, with the shale gas now in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, and the build out of gas combined cycle gas powered generation in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. I think those trends have somewhat levelized, but that was a period of significant change.
Yeah, and we're in a significant period of building the grid of the future in the various states right now too. We're changing policies at a pace that makes my head spin as well.
Sure.
So, okay, and the PATH project in Western Maryland.
Yes.
Tell us about that project.
Similar set of circumstances. The problems there were not voltage collapse related as they were with the MAP project, but there was tremendous potential for overloading of backbone transmission across the Allegheny Mountains. Same basic phenomenon. The load growth was dropping off somewhat. Some of that turned out to be efficiency behaviors. Some of that may just have been the economy. There was more demand response and more generation built in the east. So the same factors that eliminated the potential for voltage collapse with MAP eliminated the heavy flows on the backbone transmission and the potential for overloads.
And CPCNs were issued for both of those?
No, they never went to hearing.
Never got a CPCN.
We had direct testimony written, but the board canceled both projects before they went to hearing.
But they were abandoned, and the transmission operators did recover
Some costs.
expense.
Some.
I think it was hundreds of millions of dollars.
I remember some was allowed and some was not. I don't remember the numbers.
All right, fair enough. I asked a question this morning of Mr. Weber about mouth. And you kind of touched on it. You just broadly said, we don't look at social costs or social benefits in our planning process. But isn't it possible that if we turn these farms, these ag farms that are the concern of some of the interveners, if we lose their preservation status, isn't it true that they might decide we're just going to sell the farm, the family farm, and that's going to turn into big costs for the local taxpayers or the state?
Yeah, and I really don't know what the legalities are, whether that's an option that they can exercise. So I hesitate to speak to that.
All right, I guess it's our charge to look at those kind of impacts for the public interest. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening.
Thank you.
Picking up on some questions that both Commissioner Herman O'Donnell asked regarding modifications of the project. If this commission does add some condition or modification to the project, perhaps the direction of it, or perhaps placing a portion of it underground or something of that sort, what does that do from a cost perspective? Who has to pick up that change, that difference?
That's an interesting question. The undergrounding it can be tremendously expensive, and it has been opined that if such costs were imposed through a state regulatory process, that those costs would be treated as public policy costs and therefore borne by the customers of that state. That's never happened in our planning process, that we've had to pursue that, so I don't even know that that's an accurate legal interpretation of our state public policy. We have it's called the state agreement approach,
Right.
which was developed through all of the PJM states. It's never been tested, so I don't know. If it were simply rerouted, obviously we would have to look at those costs to ensure that the project still satisfied the benefit to cost ratio requirements. But so far what we have seen with conceptual alternative 3A is that it does. But we would certainly recheck that.
Okay. Picking up on alternative 3A, in response to Cross from PPRP, and I believe this is accurate, you noted that there were several other options that would have satisfied the requirements, but 9A provided the best benefit. Was I correct in that?
There were a handful of finalists projects that satisfied the requirements, but if you looked at the range of benefits and the range of sensitivities, 9A was determined to be the most robust and the most effective solution.
So as part of PJM's review of those finalist projects, would that review have included some of the state interests that we've been discussing as part of these proceedings?
It included the issues that were identified by our constructability consultant, which may have only indirectly addressed some of your state issues. For example, in that report, I think all of the alternatives imposed on some number of endangered species, so it was somewhat of a wash. Each of them had some siting issues identified. There were no in that analysis, I would say there were no deal breakers that would suggest that one alternative was absolutely off the table, or one was, by virtue of the constructability analysis, one was far better than the others. But again, that was only those 5 alternatives. It did not include the conceptual alternatives like 3A.
Right. Okay. So of the 5 finalists that you reviewed, were they all Transource
No.
projects? So
No,
they
not.
okay. So those are projects that if for example the commission thought that one of those projects was a better option for whatever reason, we couldn't necessarily, could we?
That's a legal question that I cannot answer. The party here is Transource.
Right.
I don't know whether you can, in a CPCN, order someone else to build something else when they're not before you.
Right.
So I don't know.
Okay. All right. Do you know we had several, 2 evening, I guess they were afternoon or all day, public hearings at the 2 counties here in Maryland. And we had a number of customers and interested parties present different comments to the commission. It's all part of the record here. I don't have copies of anything to show you, but if you could accept my statement as to what we heard at that time. We did hear from some parties that expressed, they suggested that the reliability violations that were found in 2018, for lack of a better word, weren't real. That they were placed there, or they were presented to present more support for the overall project.
Sure.
And the market efficiency purpose would suddenly be not the primary reason for moving forward. What's your response to that? Because that was somewhat concerning to me.
Sure.
That was,
And I can, believe me, I can understand how people might look at the circumstances and take that opinion. I will tell you that's not the case. That my staff, when they saw the upswing in congestion in the most recent reevaluation, they came to me and said the flows that are causing this congestion could very well be causing reliability issues, and they recommended taking the line out to see what would happen. And I said absolutely, and they ran it, and the results are in my testimony. Those violations are real. If the project does not proceed in any fashion, I expect we will identify those violations in our next analysis and have to deal with them.
okay. Just one last question. I know you're familiar with Dr. I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, Tierney's rebuttal testimony. She mentioned in her testimony 3 different ways to address congestion. And we've talked about them all here: building of more generation, demand-side management programs or solutions of that sort, or providing lower transmission costs or lower generation through additional transmission options. So in light of the fact that Maryland, for the last decade or so, has had a fairly robust series of demand-side management types of initiatives and programs. As you know, most recently the state recently adopted additional RPS goals. We are looking at new ways to provide renewable energy solutions here in Maryland. Why shouldn't the commission, as part of analyzing this CPCN request, why shouldn't we think that a better solution might be out there along the lines of what happened with MAPSA and PATH?
Yeah.
That we should buckle down and focus more aggressively on renewable energy solutions in order to address these congestion
Sure.
concerns here.
If you think back to PATH and MAP, and those are really good examples of what happens when we identify a need. In this case, I believe that was in 2007 that we identified both of those needs. We worked through the process of identifying solutions. The board approved the solutions, but while that was happening, the customers, through the changing their behaviors, developing generation projects, they dramatically changed the dynamic associated with those needs. And we, PJM, seeing that, we did our reevaluations and the need was lessened and pushed out in time and eventually eliminated, and the projects were canceled. In this case, we identified these needs in 2014, and the congestion, dropped off and has swung back up again, but we have not yet seen sufficient evidence of changed behaviors that would eliminate the need for this project. And in fact, the most recent analysis suggests that those needs are increasing. Some of the issues that you're raising would help to would help to reduce that congestion. Some, as we discussed with offshore wind or even wind in other parts of PJM like Illinois, will exacerbate the problem and increase the need. So it's very hard for PJM to speculate as to what solutions will be developed where. We've tried to improve our ability to forecast, and certain things I think we've done a good job with, like residential solar panels. But some of these bigger, like offshore wind, is that's a significant wild card. The costs are tremendous, but there's a big push in lots of states, in PJM and elsewhere, to build thousands of megawatts. If that were to happen, I think some of these problems would become much worse.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Commissioner Richard. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be really quick. I realize now I'm the person keeping us after 6 o'clock. But I just wanted to pick up on Commissioner Litton's question and maybe turn it around a little bit. Going back to the IMM statements about congestion not always being bad, and then I believe it was the PPRP witness who talked about it actually sending price signals for I think the way she put it, for good solutions, for good market solutions. When we need some of those market signals, those price signals, that otherwise would,
Sure.
to send those signals that we would like to have, DERs, we'd like to have more
Sure.
energy efficiency and some of these other solutions, non-wire solutions.
No, absolutely. The question is what do you do if the market doesn't respond, and for how long? We've had price separation in the capacity market feeding into the Chicago area for years. And the prices have gone, the capacity prices have gone up considerably. A number of transmission projects have been proposed through the market as well as through our RTEP, the Regional Transmission Expansion Plan. So we've been trying to manage that. In the absence of market response, we have rules that we draw a line in the sand and then we have to fix them.
I hate to interrupt you, but
No, it's fine.
we're looking over a 15-year time frame.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're looking at. And Maryland, as Commissioner Linton, has just acted. We are continuing with our Empower program. Continuing to push
Right.
further and further on energy efficiency programs. More and more DERs. So, in a sense, I mean, that's what our state policy is. And if we undercut that, by not sending the proper price signals, again. Should we as regulators be trying to look at ways to support the state policies, or just kind of putting our thumb on the scale,
Right.
assuming that the transmission line is the answer?
That's a tough decision, and you're going to have to make it. No, I believe me, I understand. The challenge is the question that I raised before. What do you do when the market does not respond? For how long? And if you trust in these programs and the congestion persists for years and years and years, you may get some relief, but the customers are going to bear the cost of that congestion. If we have reliability problems, to us, that's not a question that we have to resolve those. That is a requirement.
And just quickly, let me get to that one as well. Since just recently it was discovered that we do have a reliability issue impending on the eastern part of the project, and it just turned out that this project would resolve that. However, when I'm hearing staff, just recently we're talking about the fact that there's a different allocation methodology for reliability projects as opposed to market efficiency. As again, regulators for the state, should we be looking at that different allocation methodology as maybe benefiting Marylanders? I mean, if it's a reliability project and 50% of that cost will be picked up and socialized throughout PJM, isn't that a good deal for Marylanders?
Just to be clear, that the reliability solutions will be one piece of the problem that you have to address. Obviously, there will be costs associated with those, and we have no idea yet what those would be, nor how would they be allocated. It's certainly possible that your shares would be more or less the same, but I can't say that. We haven't done any analysis. There will be congestion left on the table. So if we solve the problems in the east, there will be congestion in the west. The western half of this project solves a lot of congestion. So realistically, we would have to address that congestion, and who that would be allocated to would all depend on the nature of those solutions as well.
At this point, we don't even have an analysis to know, as far as just cost to Marylanders, the benefits of going with the reliability approach
Yeah.
as opposed to moving right away.
Right.
On a
And we do not.
And the fact is, this was just recently discovered, right? Last
End of
September.
2018.
Yeah, last September 2018. So this is something PGM would be addressing right away anyway. Is that correct?
If this project does not move forward, we would be addressing it right away.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yes.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I just wanted to do a quick follow-up. How might the retirement of large baseload generating facilities such as TMI Unit 1 or other large baseload plants retiring in the Pennsylvania, Ohio area, maybe First Energy Solutions, who knows?
Yeah.
How might that affect the analysis and the need for this project?
Yeah, TMI has already factored into these analyses. That's been assumed to be retired, so that's done and done. If it were to be returned to service, we would factor it in. I would expect it would actually push more southward and make the problems worse. If we were to see Calvert Cliffs retire, that would create a considerable inflow of energy into this area and exacerbate those problems. A number of the FE retirements, I believe, are already factored in, but I'm not positive as to all of them.
Very good. Thank you.
Do any of the parties have questions based on the commissioner's questions of the witness?
None, Your Honor.
I have 3.
Do other parties?
I might. I'm going to wait to hear the.
Okay. Ms. McElmore, if we could keep it moving.
I will try to be very brief. And please tell me if I misstate something too. This is
Sure.
kind of late for me as well. Commissioner Linton just asked about the recent reliability increase in the public comments. Do you remember that?
Their concern about the identification of the reliability criteria violations, yes.
Right. And also, in discussion with Commissioner Herman, I believe you agreed that the generators who recently were given injection rights would rely on the IAC or something similar to be built. Is that correct?
Any generator in the queue after this project was approved by the board could have additional upgrades identified by virtue of its removal if the project were rejected. So it doesn't matter where they are in the queue. They don't have to already have rights. They could literally have gotten into the queue. It was approved in August of 16. If they got in the queue in January of 17, they would be dependent on this project. So when you remove it,
Remove it from where exactly?
if this project were denied
Right.
and we removed it from our models,
From your model. Okay.
we would have to restudy those generators,
Mhm.
and we may, in some instances, identify further upgrades because the IEC is not in the model. We might find a problem and have to fix it.
Now, based on that, is it fair to say that the inclusion of these additional injection rights with the additional generators in the queue for these generators may play a part for the increase in reliability recently in the model?
I'm sorry, I'm not following you.
Is it fair to say that the additional injection rights for these generators that are now in the queue, that have yet to be built but are in the queue, that the inclusion of the AEP project in the model, and then would that have played a significant part on the additional reliability that was discussed with Mr. Linton?
I don't think so, but I can't say that as an absolute because the generators when we do our reliability analyses, we're not including the generators in the early stages of the interconnection process. So the violations we identified late last year would not include anyone who had just gotten into the queue in the last year or so. They would have had to have moved along to an ISA. So it would be a much smaller universe of projects that might be a factor for, but I can't say with certainty.
So when is it that they are included? After the ISA?
Now, there's two different paths here. By FERC rule, once the project was approved, when we built the next case, any generator that got in the queue the next day was entitled to utilize the capability of this project. And by FERC rule, any subsequent change, like the project being rejected and removed from the model, is not the fault of the generator in the queue. It becomes a baseline issue and the responsibility of load customers. So now, many of those projects may drop out and it won't be an issue. But any of them that move forward, if they were dependent on 9A, and now 9A is removed, they are entitled to, we have to identify a replacement upgrade for them, and that cost will not be their responsibility.
Right, I understand that, but when would it be included in the model, the RTEP model? To
A
look at-
generator,
Right,
after it signs in its interconnection service agreement.
all right, thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander.
3. You were asked by the commissioners about the path line and the map line,
Yes.
correct? And at the time that these went through the RTEP process, there were 3 what were called baseline projects: the trail line, the map line, and the path line, correct?
There was more than that, but yes, those 3.
Okay. Now the trail line went into service,
It
right?
did.
And the parties had argued that an upgrade to a Dominion line, I believe,
Mount Storm Dobbs.
yes, Mount Storm Dobbs, thank you, you're bringing back the memories, would resolve the problems, along with the fact that they claimed that the PJM load forecast was very overly optimistic. Isn't that correct? That's what they argued.
I remember all of those parts and pieces. The Mount Storm Dobbs project eventually did go forward, but it was in combination with all of the other factors that I described. Mount Storm Dobbs did not affect MAP. It may have affected path.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, I know you were involved in some way or another in all of these, because we met on all of these.
Yes.
Isn't it true that PJM only reevaluated the path line because the hearing examiners at the Public Utilities Commission in Virginia, at the request of staff, agreed to let you withdraw the case, the path subcompanies, which AEP was a part of, and the hearing examiner in Pennsylvania ordered PJM to redo their modeling because the forecast was so out of whack and behind. Isn't that true, that there were hearing examiner decisions in both those cases?
Objection.
Sustained. Outside of the scope of testimony today. What's your next question, Mr. Alexander?
The next question is, with those 3 lines were all, as a cumulative amount, would have been around $1.5 to $2 billion, correct?
The path line and the map line, probably between them would have been about $2 billion.
That's what I mean. And if they had gone forward, it turns out that they weren't needed, but ratepayers would be on the line for up to $2 billion, right?
And as I said, PJM did analysis of both of those lines as all of those factors changed and all of those customer behaviors in the market changed. And it was PJM that determined that the need was evaporating and eventually was removed. We've been doing reanalysis now for a number of years on this project as well. So, your point is, yes, if the line had gone all the way to construction, the original need was no longer there, but we identified that before it even went to hearing.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor, that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Mr. Dean, any? Okay. Thank you. The witness is excused. This hearing is adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Who's next?